The first time my neighbor knocked on my door after midnight, I thought he needed a simple favor. I never imagined that one small moment would completely change the way I saw the person living just a few steps away. My name is Lucas Bennett, and before that night, I was perfectly comfortable with my quiet routine. I lived alone in my apartment, worked long hours, and enjoyed the simplicity of having my own space. My life was not lonely exactly. It was just predictable. I knew what to expect every day, and I liked it that way. I had my morning coffee, my evening walks, and my peaceful nights without interruptions. Then Ethan Brooks moved into the apartment next door. At first, he was just another neighbor. We exchanged polite greetings in the hallway, talked briefly about the weather, and occasionally helped each other with small things. He seemed friendly, but I never thought much about it. He was simply someone who lived nearby. Someone I might see for a few seconds before continuing with my own life. That changed one evening when I heard a knock on my door. When I opened it, Ethan was standing there with a hesitant expression. He apologized for bothering me and explained that he had a difficult situation with his apartment that night. He asked if he could stay for a little while until things were sorted out. It was unexpected, but something about the way he asked made me feel that he was not looking for sympathy. He simply needed a place where he could feel comfortable for a short time. I told him he could come in. I thought it would be one evening and nothing more. A few hours later, we were sitting in my living room talking about things we had never discussed before. We talked about work, childhood memories, favorite movies, and the little things that made us laugh. It surprised me how easy the conversation felt. I had known Ethan as my neighbor for months, but that night I felt like I was meeting him for the first time. The next morning, I expected everything to return to normal. I thought Ethan would go back to his apartment, and we would return to being two neighbors who occasionally said hello. But later that evening, there was another knock at my door. Ethan stood there again. This time, he looked almost embarrassed. He explained that he did not want to be a burden, but he wondered if he could spend another evening at my place. I agreed, still thinking it was temporary. I did not realize then that this would become a new routine. One night became several nights. Several nights became a pattern. Soon, I started noticing small changes in my own life. My apartment, which had always been a quiet place where I spent time alone, began to feel different. There were conversations during dinner. There were moments of laughter after long days. There was another person who understood the silence without needing to fill every second of it. The strange thing was that Ethan was still a mystery to me. I knew his name. I knew his habits. I knew the stories he chose to share. But I also felt there was something he was keeping to himself. Something about why he kept coming back that I did not understand. At the time, I thought Ethan was simply looking for a comfortable place to stay. I had no idea that the reason he kept showing up at my door had nothing to do with the apartment itself. It was about something much deeper that neither of us was ready to admit. At first, I thought Ethan Brooks staying at my apartment would be a temporary situation. I believed that after a few nights, everything would return to normal, and we would go back to being two neighbors who simply exchanged friendly greetings in the hallway. But something unexpected happened. The longer Ethan stayed, the less it felt like he was just a guest. Somehow, without either of us realizing it, he became part of my everyday life. The first thing I noticed was how naturally he fit into my routine. My apartment had always been a place where I could disconnect from the rest of the world. It was quiet, organized, and predictable. But with Ethan around, the silence changed. It was no longer an empty space. It became a place filled with conversations, shared meals, and small moments that made ordinary days feel different. Ethan never acted like he was taking over my space. He was always careful to respect my routines. He would ask before using anything, help, clean up after dinner, and make sure I knew he appreciated my kindness. That was one of the things that surprised me about him. He was not someone who expected people to make room for him. He was someone who seemed almost uncomfortable receiving help, even when he clearly needed it. As the nights continued, I started learning more about Ethan. I discovered that he was someone who noticed details most people ignored. He remembered how I liked my coffee. He noticed when I had a stressful day before I even mentioned it. He could tell when I wanted to talk and when I simply needed quiet company. Those small things should not have mattered as much as they did, but they did. I had spent so much time believing that being independent meant needing no one. Ethan quietly challenged that idea without ever trying to change me. He showed me that allowing someone into your life did not mean losing your independence. It simply meant sharing pieces of yourself with someone who cared. Still, there was one thing I could not understand. Why did Ethan keep coming back? His apartment situation had already improved, and he could have easily returned to his own place. I never wanted to pressure him or make him feel uncomfortable, so I avoided asking directly. But the question stayed in my mind. Every evening when he knocked on my door, I wondered what he was really looking for. One night, we were sitting at the kitchen table after dinner, and Ethan suddenly became quiet. It was different from his usual comfortable silence. Felt like there was something on his mind. I asked him if everything was okay, but he smiled and said he was just thinking. I wanted to ask more, but I decided not to push. I had a feeling that whatever he was carrying was something personal. Over time, I realized that Ethan was not just someone who needed a temporary place to stay. He was someone who had found a place where he felt comfortable being himself. And the more I saw that, the more I started questioning something about my own feelings. I wondered why I looked forward to hearing that knock at my door every evening. I wondered why my apartment felt different when Ethan was there. I wondered when exactly my neighbor had stopped feeling like a neighbor and started feeling like someone important. The truth was, something between us was changing. Neither of us had said it out loud yet, but we both felt it. I never expected my relationship with Ethan Brooks to change the way it did. When he first came to my apartment, I saw him as my neighbor who needed a little help. I never imagined that a few simple evenings together would make me question the way I had always viewed connection and trust. But the more time we spent together, the more I realized Ethan was not just someone passing through my life. He was becoming someone I genuinely cared about. The strange thing was that nothing between us happened suddenly. There was no single moment where everything changed. Instead, it happened through small things that were easy to overlook. It was the way Ethan would leave a note when he borrowed something. It was the way he would bring back coffee when he noticed I had a busy morning. It was the way he would ask about my day and actually listen to the answer. Those little moments slowly created something I had not expected. A sense of comfort. Before Ethan came into my life, I was used to handling everything on my own. I believed being independent meant keeping certain parts of myself private. I thought needing people created complications. But Ethan showed me that connection did not have to feel overwhelming. Sometimes it could simply feel natural. One evening, we were sitting in the living room watching an old movie. It was not a special occasion. It was just another quiet night. But I remember noticing how different my apartment felt. A place that had once been completely silent now felt warm and familiar. I realized that I had started looking forward to these evenings more than I wanted to admit. That realization surprised me. I had spent so much time protecting my own space, yet I found myself making room for someone else without feeling like I was losing anything. Still, I knew there was something Ethan was not telling me. I could feel it in the moments when conversations became too personal. Sometimes he would start explaining something about himself and then suddenly change the subject. Other times, I would notice him looking around my apartment as if he was memorizing every detail. It made me wonder what this place represented to him. I finally decided to ask him one night. We were cleaning up after dinner when I casually asked why he preferred spending his evenings at my apartment when his own place was available again. Ethan became quiet for a moment. He smiled slightly and said he knew I was eventually going to ask. He told me it was not because of the apartment. It was not because his place was uncomfortable. It was because something about being there made him feel different. I did not fully understand what he meant at first. He explained that my apartment was one of the few places where he did not feel like he had to pretend everything was fine. He said that around me he could simply be himself. Hearing that affected me more than I expected. I had always thought I was the person giving him a safe place to stay. But I began to realize that Ethan was giving me something too. He was reminding me what it felt like to share life with someone. That night, after he left for the room where he usually stayed, I sat alone and thought about everything that had changed. Ethan was still my neighbor, but that description no longer felt complete. He had become someone I trusted, someone I looked for at the end of the day, someone whose absence I noticed. And that was when I started wondering if the reason Ethan kept coming back was not the only mystery in my apartment. Maybe the bigger mystery was why I wanted him to stay. The more time Ethan Brooks spent at my apartment, the more I realized that our situation had quietly become something neither of us had planned. What started as a simple favor had turned into a routine that felt almost natural. But with that comfort came a question I could not ignore anymore. What exactly were we becoming to each other? I had spent so much time noticing how Ethan changed my daily life that I had not stopped to think about how much I was changing too. Before Ethan arrived, I was someone who valued control. I liked knowing what each day would look like. I liked having my own schedule, my own space, and my own way of doing things. But Ethan brought a different kind of energy into my life. He reminded me that unexpected moments could sometimes become the most meaningful ones. One evening, we were sitting by the window during a quiet rainstorm. Ethan was telling me a story from his childhood, and I found myself paying attention to every detail. Not because the story was extraordinary, but because I realized I enjoyed hearing him talk. I enjoyed knowing the little things that made him who he was. That was when I understood something had shifted. I was no longer simply allowing Ethan to stay. I was looking forward to having him there. That realization made me uncomfortable because I was not used to depending on someone else's presence to make my day better. I had always believed that needing someone gave them the ability to disappoint you. So I built a life where disappointment was less likely. But Ethan was showing me that avoiding every possible disappointment also meant avoiding meaningful connections. Still, there were moments when I noticed Ethan pulling back. He would sometimes become quiet after we shared a personal conversation. He would apologize for staying too long or say that he did not want to make things difficult for me. Every time he said that, I wanted to tell him he was not a problem. I wanted him to know that his presence had become something I appreciated. But I held back because I did not know if I was misunderstanding the situation. I did not know if Ethan saw me as a friend or if there was something deeper that neither of us was willing to acknowledge. One night after dinner, Ethan started gathering his things earlier than usual. He said he thought he should give me some space and spend more time at his own apartment. The moment he said it, I felt something I did not expect. Disappointment. I tried to hide it, but Ethan noticed. He asked if everything was okay. For a few seconds, I almost told him the truth. I almost admitted that my apartment felt different when he was not there. But instead, I simply said that I understood. After he left, I sat in the quiet room and realized how much had changed. Few months earlier, I would have enjoyed that silence. It would have felt peaceful. But now it felt empty. That was when I finally admitted something to myself. Ethan was not just someone who had found comfort in my apartment. He had become someone who made my apartment feel like home. The next evening, when I heard the familiar knock at my door, I felt a sense of relief that surprised me. When I opened it and saw Ethan standing there, I knew something between us had changed, but I also knew there were still things we had not said. And sooner or later, we would have to face the feelings we had both been quietly avoiding. After Ethan Brooks returned to my apartment that evening, I realized that the silence between us felt different. It was not the comfortable silence we had created over the past weeks. It was the kind of silence that carried questions neither of us wanted to ask first. We both knew something had changed, but we were still trying to understand what that change meant. Ethan walked inside, placed his things down, and gave me a small smile. It was the same smile I had seen many times before, but this time I noticed something behind it. He looked uncertain. For someone who always seemed thoughtful and confident, Ethan suddenly looked like someone who was afraid of saying the wrong thing. I asked him if he was okay, and for a moment he did not answer. Then he told me that he had been thinking about everything that happened between us. He said he never expected a temporary stay at a neighbor's apartment to become something that mattered so much. He admitted that at first, he only needed a comfortable place to spend some time. But eventually, it was not the apartment that kept bringing him back. It was the feeling he had when he was there. He said that around me, he did not feel like he had to pretend everything was perfect. He could talk about his worries, his dreams, and the parts of himself he usually kept hidden. Hearing that made me realize something important. I had been wondering why Ethan kept coming back, but I had never considered that maybe he was wondering the same thing about me. Maybe we were both trying to understand a connection that neither of us expected. I told Ethan that I felt the same way. I explained that my apartment had changed because he was there. The routines I once protected so carefully no longer felt as important as the moments we shared. I told him that I had started looking forward to our conversations, our dinners, and even the simple moments when we sat in the same room without needing to say anything. Ethan listened quietly. Then he admitted that he was afraid. Not because of me, but because he did not want to misunderstand what was happening between us. He was afraid that if he said too much, he might change something that had become important. I understood that fear because I had been feeling something similar. Neither of us wanted to lose the friendship we had built. Neither of us wanted to risk a connection that felt rare. But avoiding the truth was also creating distance. That night, we finally had the conversation we had been avoiding. We talked about how strange it was that two people could live so close to each other for months and never truly know one another until one unexpected moment changed everything. We talked about how some people enter your life quietly and slowly become someone you cannot imagine being without. When the conversation ended, nothing was officially decided. There were no promises or dramatic declarations. But something important had happened. We had stopped pretending that Ethan was just my neighbor staying at my apartment. We had acknowledged that there was something deeper between us. The next morning, I woke up and saw Ethan making coffee in my kitchen like he had done many times before. But this time felt different. It was no longer just a routine. It felt like the beginning of something neither of us fully understood yet. And that was when I realized the biggest change was not that Ethan had started staying at my apartment every night. The biggest change was that somewhere along the way, we had both started feeling like we belonged there together. After the conversation Ethan Brooks and I finally had, I thought everything would suddenly become easier. I thought that once we admitted there was something different between us, we would automatically know what to do next. But the truth was, understanding our feelings was only the beginning. The next challenge was learning how to move forward without losing the trust we had built. For the first time since Ethan came into my life, we were no longer avoiding the questions that mattered. We talked openly about what had changed and why it felt different. We talked about how strange it was that a person who had once been a stranger in the hallway had become someone I looked forward to seeing every day. Ethan told me that he never expected to feel comfortable enough with someone to share the parts of himself he usually kept hidden. He said that before moving into the apartment next door, he had become used to keeping everything to himself. He was independent, but sometimes that independence felt more like isolation. I understood what he meant because I had lived a similar way. I had convinced myself that being alone was easier because it meant I never had to depend on anyone. But Ethan showed me that depending on someone did not always mean losing control. Sometimes it meant trusting someone enough to let them know you. Over the next few weeks, our relationship changed in small but meaningful ways. We started planning dinners instead of simply eating whenever we happened to be hungry. We talked about our future goals instead of only discussing what happened that day. We learned more about each other's dreams, fears, and experiences. The apartment that once belonged only to me became a place where both of us created memories. Still, there was one thing Ethan had not fully explained. I knew he enjoyed being there, and I knew he felt comfortable with me, but I sensed there was a deeper reason behind why he had needed that connection so badly. One evening, while we were sitting together after dinner, Ethan became unusually quiet. I asked him what he was thinking about. This time, instead of changing the subject, he decided to be honest. He told me that when he first came to my door, he had not only been looking for a place to spend the night. He had been looking for a place where he did not feel like he had to hide parts of himself. He explained that his own apartment had started feeling empty, not because there was anything wrong with it, but because he had been carrying everything by himself for too long. He said that being around me reminded him what it felt like to be understood. Hearing that made me realize something I had not considered before. I thought I was the person offering Ethan a safe place, but he had given me something equally important. He had reminded me that life was not meant to be experienced completely alone. I told him that I was glad he knocked on my door that night. I told him that if he had not, I might have continued living the same predictable life without ever realizing what I was missing. Ethan smiled and said he felt the same way. He said that sometimes the most important changes happen through unexpected moments that seem ordinary at first. That night, we did not make any big promises. We did not try to define everything immediately. Instead, we simply appreciated the honesty we had finally created between us. But deep down, I knew something had shifted. Ethan was no longer just the person living next door. He was someone who had become part of my life in a way I never expected. And the more I understood his story, the more I realized that the reason he stayed was not because he needed a place to go. He stayed because he had found a place where he felt like he belonged. For the first time in a long while, my life felt like it had a rhythm I never expected. Ethan Brooks was no longer just someone who stayed at my apartment because of an unusual situation. He had become part of my everyday life, and I had started building my days around the simple moments we shared. But as comfortable as everything felt, there was still one thing we both avoided talking about. We had created a connection that felt deeper than friendship, but neither of us knew what would happen if we admitted it completely. I think part of us was afraid that naming what we felt would change everything. One evening, Ethan and I were sitting on the balcony outside my apartment, watching the lights from the buildings around us. It was a quiet night, the kind where you could hear the city moving in the distance while everything around you felt still. Ethan looked thoughtful, and I could tell something was on his mind. He told me that he had been thinking about how much his life had changed since he moved next door. He said he never expected a simple conversation in a hallway to lead to something that meant so much. I smiled because I felt the same way. I told him that before he came into my life, I thought I understood what happiness looked like. I thought it was having a comfortable routine and being able to handle everything alone. But Ethan helped me realize that happiness could also come from sharing ordinary moments with someone who truly understood you. Ethan looked at me and said something I never forgot. He said that the hardest part was not realizing how much he cared about me. The hardest part was accepting that he had been afraid to let someone matter that much. His words stayed with me because I understood exactly what he meant. I had spent years protecting myself from disappointment, and Ethan had done the same thing in his own way. We both wanted connection, but we were both afraid of what could happen if we allowed ourselves to need someone. That night, we finally talked about the future. Not in a dramatic way, but honestly, we discussed what would happen if things changed. We talked about whether Ethan would eventually move back into his own routine completely. We talked about whether our friendship could remain the same if we followed the feelings we were beginning to understand. There were no easy answers, but for the first time, we were not avoiding the conversation. Ethan told me that he did not want to be someone who only stayed because he was comfortable. He wanted to be someone who made a choice. That meant a lot to me because I did not want Ethan to feel like he owed me anything. I wanted him to stay because he wanted to, not because my apartment had become a temporary escape. I told him that the most important thing was honesty. Whatever happened next, I wanted us to be honest with each other. After that conversation, something between us felt lighter. We were still figuring things out, but the fear was not controlling us anymore. We started enjoying our time together without constantly questioning what every moment meant. We laughed more. We talked more openly. We stopped trying to predict the future and focused on appreciating what we had. But even though things felt better than ever, I knew a bigger decision was coming. At some point, Ethan and I would have to decide whether we were simply two neighbors who found comfort in each other or two people who had discovered something much more meaningful. And the answer would change everything. After the conversation Ethan Brooks and I shared that night, I thought we had finally reached a place where we could stop worrying about what everything meant. We had spent so much time carefully choosing our words, protecting ourselves from uncertainty, and wondering if we were feeling the same things. But once we started being honest, I realized the truth was much simpler. We cared about each other, and that mattered more than having every answer immediately. Still, knowing that something was changing did not make the next steps easy. Sometimes the hardest part of letting someone into your life is accepting that you cannot control what happens next. For a long time, I had built my life around certainty. I planned everything carefully because it made me feel secure. But Ethan had shown me that some of the most meaningful moments come from situations you never expected. One morning, Ethan told me that he had been thinking about moving back fully into his own apartment. When he said it, I felt a strange combination of emotions. Part of me understood. His apartment was his home, and he deserved to have his own space. But another part of me felt a quiet sadness because I knew things would not be the same. Ethan noticed my expression and asked if I was disappointed. For a moment, I wanted to say no because I did not want him to feel guilty. But I had learned that honesty was more important than pretending everything was fine. I told him that I would miss having him around. I told him that his presence had become something I appreciated more than I expected. Ethan smiled and admitted that he felt the same way. He said he had been worried that leaving would make me think he was creating distance between us. I told him that was not true. I did not want him to stay because he felt obligated. I wanted him to stay because he chose to. That conversation changed something important between us. Before, we were afraid that being honest would make things complicated. But the opposite happened. Honesty made everything feel clearer. Over the next few days, we started finding a balance that worked for both of us. Ethan spent more time in his own apartment, but he still came over for dinner and our usual conversations. The difference was that now, his visits were not based on needing somewhere to be. They were based on wanting to be there. That small change meant everything. One evening, Ethan and I sat together in the living room, remembering how unusual our situation had been from the beginning. We laughed about how neither of us could have predicted that a simple knock on my door would lead to such a meaningful connection. Ethan told me that meeting me changed the way he viewed relationships. He said he used to think people either fit perfectly into your life or they did not. But he learned that sometimes people grow together through patience, understanding, and small moments. I told him that I had learned something too. I learned that letting someone in did not mean losing myself. It meant allowing another person to see the parts of me that I usually kept hidden. As the weeks passed, we stopped focusing on what we were afraid of losing and started appreciating what we were building. We were not trying to force a perfect story. We were simply two people choosing to be honest with each other. But there was still one final question we had not answered. If Ethan was no longer staying because he needed a place to go, and I was no longer afraid of needing someone, then what exactly were we becoming? When I think about how everything started with Ethan Brooks, I still find it hard to believe that such an important connection began with something so ordinary. It started with a simple knock on my door and a neighbor who needed a place to feel comfortable for a little while. At that moment, I never imagined that Ethan would become someone who would change the way I understood trust, connection, and what it means to let another person into your life. Over time, we stopped thinking about how unusual our situation was and started focusing on what we had created together. Ethan was no longer staying at my apartment because he needed somewhere to go. He was there because we had built something meaningful, something based on honesty and understanding. The biggest change was that neither of us felt trapped by expectations anymore. We were not holding on to each other because we were afraid of being alone. We were choosing each other because we genuinely enjoyed the life we created together. One evening, Ethan and I sat in the same living room where we had shared countless conversations. We talked about the first night he knocked on my door and laughed about how uncertain everything had seemed back then. Ethan admitted that he was nervous that night. He said he almost walked away before asking for help because he did not want to inconvenience me. I told him that if he had never knocked, I probably would have continued living the same routine without realizing how much I was missing. Ethan smiled and said that maybe some of the best things in life happen when we are brave enough to take a small step into the unknown. That conversation reminded me how much both of us had changed. Ethan had learned that he did not have to carry everything alone. I had learned that protecting myself from every possible disappointment also meant protecting myself from meaningful experiences. We had both discovered that vulnerability was not a weakness. It was the foundation of a real connection. Eventually, Ethan moved his remaining belongings back into his own apartment, but the distance between our doors no longer represented separation. It simply meant we had two spaces that were connected by something much stronger than convenience. He still came over often. We still shared dinners, conversations, and quiet evenings. The difference was that now every moment was a choice. Not a necessity. Not an obligation. A choice. Looking back, I realized that the biggest surprise was never that my neighbor started spending so much time with me. The biggest surprise was discovering that someone who entered my life unexpectedly could become one of the most important people I had ever known. Ethan taught me that home is not always a place. Sometimes home is the feeling you have when you are with someone who understands you. It is the comfort of being accepted without needing to pretend. It is the peace of knowing that someone sees who you truly are and still chooses to stay. Ethan Brooks was once just the person living next door. Then he became the person I looked forward to seeing every day. And eventually, he became the person who showed me that the most meaningful relationships are not always the ones we plan for. Sometimes they are the ones that quietly find us when we least expect them.